Well, good evening and welcome to the second edition of Conversations On, where we tackle a topic and to try and bring out into the public arena very often debates and discussions which happen behind closed doors within seminaries and universities. An attempt at public theology. Last time it was Lamentations, and this time we're going to have a look at the Ascension, probably the most underutilized part of the story of Jesus. We talk about the incarnation a lot, about the cross and about resurrection, but as we'll see, this subject of the Ascension opens up all sorts of subject areas. So that's our conversation for this time.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this, our second meeting of Conversations On. And our conversation today is on the Ascension of Christ. I'm Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. I'm the Professor of Ancient History at Cardiff University, and I'm going to ask my friends and colleagues to introduce themselves. Rose?
My name is Reverend Rosemary Hill. I am Vicar in Pontyclun Talagan and Llanharry. My research interest is trauma theology and Lamentations.
And Vincent?
I'm Reverend Vincent Gardner. I'm the ministry area lead for the group of churches around Llantrisant, and I'm a little bit interested in the Ascension.
To say the least. Yeah, Vincent, I should tell everybody, Vincent set us on this topic and it's been a wormhole. It really has. It's quite incredible, especially when we have to realize how little in the scriptures is little attention is given to the Ascension itself. I'm going to read out the two brief mentions we have, both penned by Luke, one in the Gospel of Luke and the other in Acts, and really that's all we have to go on. So here we are at the last chapter of Luke, Luke 24, verse 50 to 53. When he, Jesus, had led them out into the vicinity of Bethany, he lifted up his hands and blessed them, that's the disciples. While he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. Then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. And that's the end of the Gospel, with this very brief mention. And then we go next to the book of Acts, chapter 1, where we have in just two verses, verse 10 and 11, they, the disciples, were looking intently up into the sky as he, Jesus, was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way as you have seen him go into heaven. And that's it. So Vincent, the first question is you. Why the Ascension? Why is it given so little prominence in the New Testament? And I suppose as a consequence, is it a consequence that it's given so little attention in theological study and in particular within the church, the life of the church, in the liturgy itself? What do you think is going on?
I mean, I think there's historical reasons about the way the early church developed, and the concentration, the debates initially were to defend who Christ was, who Jesus was, what his nature was, etc. What intrigues me, that yes, the topic of Ascension hasn't featured large for 2,000 years, but in the last 100 years, it is starting to be a topic of study and debate and philosophical debate, just when in the non-religious world, in the science world, we have this development of quantum physics and a complete different view of space and time, etc. So suddenly it becomes a topic of interest because we can actually contribute to that science debate. The one thing I would declare from the beginning, my interest is very often you see a lot of churches, Anglican churches, the incarnation is the most important thing. For a lot of Protestant churches, evangelical churches, or Catholic churches, the cross is the most important thing. And they see everything through the light of that. For a lot of charismatic churches, the kingdom, the resurrection is the most important thing. But for me, those are all immaterial unless you have an ascension. The ascension completes that journey. As Matthew 27 says, lots of people were raised from the dead. So it's not unique. What is unique in probably all world religions is someone who says, I am God, but is a particular human being, and then disappears from our space to enter the other space where God is supposed to reside, but takes his human body with him. That's a massive scientific, philosophical, and faith challenge. That's what intrigues me and opens up so many other questions.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think with the point on science that you say there, I think, you know, it's that old adage, isn't it? Once you have a word for something, then you can engage with it more and more. So now that we have a more kind of scientific language, actually, which fits around the idea of the ascension, then perhaps that's why it's coming to light. Over to you. What, as a minister, as a priest practicing within the church, I'm interested to know about whether you engage with the ascension routinely with your congregation. You know, we all have an Ascension Sunday, all right? I mean, you know, it's there. What happens on it for you? I mean, what does your congregation make of the ascension? Does it engage with it at all?
I think it's worth saying is straight away from the start, as we engage with Ascension every time we have the Eucharist, if we say the creeds, we engage with the Ascension when we say the offices. If you say the Apostles' Creed in the offices, it's not just on Ascension Sunday, it's on, you know, it's every Sunday. And indeed, you know, on Trinity Sunday, you know, the Athanasius Creed, you go into it in a huge amount of detail. But I think in terms of the church, I don't think we engage with it. I think it really is, you know, I when I was doing researching for this, I went to this lovely tome. It's like a brick, and it's called the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So this is the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. It's a brick, and Ascension is literally that all the Ascension in it. So the thing is, apart from a couple of little mentions elsewhere, and so the thing is I think it isn't really talked about, it isn't preached about that much. You know, it's something is that, you know, for many years, in fact it still is that it's a day of obligation. We are supposed to celebrate Mass on the Ascension, you know. And but I don't think it is that our congregations are quite aware of the significance of it, and I do wonder whether it's because it's like the Trinity, you know, is as a curate and things, you know, I can remember feeling that little slight bit of dread that first time that I had to preach Trinity Sunday, because it was sort of, you know, it was like, am I going to play heresy bingo this Sunday? And it's the same with the Ascension, because our Catechism says, you know, the Creed says, ascended to the right hand of the Father, but then the theology says that Jesus is taken into the Godhead. So it's which is it? Is he sitting at the right hand side? And we'll get into that later in terms of space and time and things like that. But I think it's such a simple doctrine, but it's such a complex doctrine at the same time that it can be quite hard to comprehend. And sometimes we as priests make it more difficult than it needs to be as well.
Yes, I think there's something in that, because really at the end of the day, the Ascension is the culmination of Christ's earthly work, right? I mean, that's essentially it, because the Messiah's story doesn't stop at the resurrection. Otherwise, Christ would still be with us now, you know, he'd still be walking the earth. We would assume as a very, very old man in that case, all right? Because after all, he's fully mortal as well as he's fully divine. But without the ascension, Christ's work then is incomplete. So it's needed. I mean, it is needed to fulfill the circle, isn't it? You know, to return to the Father in that way, which is all the more remarkable, really, why so little attention has been given to this subject. Douglas Farrow has said actually that amongst theologians, the topic of the Ascension is something of an embarrassment, he says. embarrassment. Is that a word that you could identify with when it comes to this, Vincent?
I think so. I think the topic of incarnation is so much easier to explain to a congregation, because then we just model our lives ethically on someone who lived in a perfect way. That's something we can get to grips with, get our head around. By the way, the reason I'm a little bit obsessed with the Ascension stuff, because Doug Fowler was my tutor at a certain point. And he's written quite a few books, which for those who want to follow this up are probably the best there is on the subject. But yes, the Ascension is puzzling, but because it's puzzling, it's the right time to begin to look at it, because it does open up creatively so many other stories. One of the things we talked about last time is, and hinted at, is what's going to happen when we come out of the restrictive year we've had, the limited space that we had. And here's this theme of space again. We're going to be moving into a different space. It's not going to be the same space that we had before lockdown. And so we need to explore God in a new way. I don't think the Jesus, the ethical Jesus, actually tackles the big questions which a lot of contemporary folk have now, but Ascension does offer some possibilities, which we will explore.
There's a passage in John 16 where Jesus addresses the disciples, and he says, it's for your benefit that I go away, because if I don't go away, I think a word he uses then is the counselor. I think he means that then the Spirit will not be able to come to you. So you're right. I mean, Jesus in his ministry itself seems to be aware of the next step that has to be taken, which is upwards. So yes, so this is a very good access point for us in today's church, I think, to think further about, okay, now where are we going to go with this then? Jesus gives us that leeway to think about, okay, I'm going to go so that you can take charge, really, so you can fill in the gaps, really. Does that appeal to you, Rose? Is that kind of thing? Sorry, Vincent, do you want to say something? Rose?
In what way does it appeal?
Does that speak to you? The idea that I go away because if I don't, the counselor, the Spirit, won't come to you. And of course, what we have, isn't it, is Pentecost. I mean, that's a day that we celebrate big time in the church, where the Spirit now resides on earth. Without Christ going, the Spirit will not come.
I think there's definitely a sense of, I think for me almost a sense of, I suppose for want of a better phrase, annunciation about the Ascension. That it's at this point that Christ goes up into heaven, and then a week or so later the church is birthed. And so there's a sense of that's almost like the birth pangs, because the disciples go to the upper room, they're scared, they don't want to go and engage in professing the gospel as they were told to do. And so I think there is a sense of that sort of engagement with the Ascension, that it is important, that without it we can't have the Holy Spirit. Without the Ascension we wouldn't have the church. But there's glimmers of the Ascension throughout the Gospels. I always think about the Transfiguration as a physical ascension. Christ goes up the mountain, he glows there with Elijah, and now Peter's like, oh, shall I build you a house? And he's like, no, don't do that, don't be so silly. And then we have this Vincent would disagree with me, this spiritual ascension then at this point after but we know is at the point of resurrection. He says to Mary Magdalene, don't trust me, don't touch me, and this idea of that there's almost a bodily change, and that happened at the resurrection, that then continues through to the Ascension, and then continues through to Pentecost, and then continues through our history as a church.
So let me ask you then, if Christ is gone, is he still fundamental to the work to work on earth, or are we now simply in the age of the Holy Spirit?
See, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't on this one.
I mean, come on.
Go on, Vincent. I'm going to leave this thing. Go on, Vincent. You go in first.
Well, there's a couple of things we just be thinking about, but compare the God of the Old Testament to the Jesus of the New Testament. What we're arguing, by the way, to draw a line in the sand, and the challenge is, and we had this discussion a little bit before we started with Jack, what is the nature of the body of Jesus after the resurrection? And I would argue firmly, it is a physical, material body. That's the whole point. So what you have in Jesus is God in Jesus, in a particular space, in a particular person, in a small space. And then he ascends into a larger space, whereas in the Old Testament, the movement is in the opposite direction. What you have is God everywhere, who makes a decision with Israel to, in a sense, squeeze himself into a small space, the Shekinah, into the Ark of the Covenant. So what you have is the opposite movement from the particular to the universal. I mean, I wouldn't, there was a Catholic theologian, Teilhard de Chardin, who then talks about Christ has become a cosmic Christ, and I wouldn't go that far, because I want to hold on to, like Karl Marx, I want to hold on to Christ's material, physical body. But anyway.
Yes, yeah, Rose.
Therein lies the difficulty then of the ascension, because I would agree with Vincent of a full bodily resurrection. You know, I think anything else is to deny the resurrection, which means I wouldn't be here if I did, you know. But it's that sense of then is what happens then, and I think that's the quandary that makes the ascension so difficult, because you know, the mind, it's very hard for the mind to comprehend this idea of space, this idea that Jesus is fully bodily resurrected and yet is taken up into heaven, and then what happens at that point? Because at that point, you know, is in terms of, I suppose, what we are post-enlightenment, our views of what heaven might be, and indeed what hell might be, and for some of us what purgatory might be, are informed by sort of that post-enlightenment view of those things. And so it creates this quandary then of, I believe this, but then there's a jarring with what is, and I think that's a challenge for the church to make. And
that challenge was going on right from the start. I mean, you know, Paul deals with this, and other letter writers in the early church, you know, they try to understand this idea of, okay, is there a stage then where we, in our resurrected physical form, will also be in a state of spirit before the resurrected body, you know, we become flesh and bone again. So clearly, you know, this is a complex issue that the church was dealing with. And given that those letters were written before the Gospels, it suggests to me that the ascension actually was a much bigger thing in the early church than it was later on. You know, it was kind of forgotten for some reason, you know, or it was possibly maybe because of the difficulties of that idea of body and spirit. Like the both of you, I think it's fundamental for my belief that Christ is resurrected in body and ascends in complete 100% human form. But of course, his ascension into heaven, that physical form is very different from when he came down to earth, you know. So when he's born in, you know, conceived in the womb of Mary, born as an infant. And I always feel throughout the arc then of his human life, Jesus is on a learning journey. God is on a learning journey, you know, understanding what happiness is, comfort is, pain is, distress is, joy is, whatever. And I get a sense of that more in the Gospel of Mark than anywhere else, with its abrupt beginning at the baptism, you know, without an infancy narrative or any of that. And so the God, the human, the man God that ascends to heaven takes with him then the experience of human life, right? In a way that, and even though we've mentioned this in the past in our talk on Lamentations, even though God is supposed to be omniscient and omnipresent, I still can't help thinking that God learns about us from being us as well, and that a change occurs when that physical body returns in its physicality, scars and all, okay, hands, feet and sides, to the Godhead, and is merged back with the Godhead as well. Is that something that appeals to your theology, Vincent?
I mean, for me, that's the crucial, exciting bit, that this particular human being who had divine nature within himself now takes human nature back to God. He doesn't, it's not like one of the Apollo rocket launches that as he ascends, he discards his human body and that falls back to the ground and he just ascends in spirit. No, he ascends with that human body. So God is different from that point on. God has human nature within himself. So therefore we can avoid another fall from grace. Christ doesn't have to return again and again to die because God has changed. There's not humanity and God trying to have a relationship. We're now actually one nature. One nature is the wrong word, but we're now conjoined. There's a wonderful sculpture, could call it that, I suppose, in Walsingham. When you look up in the chapel in Walsingham, there's three-dimensional feet. It's a picture of the Ascension, but you're looking upwards at Jesus's feet disappearing in the clouds, and there's a couple of flames, sculpted flames coming through his feet. So he looks like he's taken off like a rocket. And Rose mentions the Enlightenment and about reason. Well, maybe it's not the Ascension which is a problem. It's the fact that we've inherited reason from the Enlightenment, because we tend to view the Ascension that, well, if he took off with his physical body and ascended, he must still be going. If our universe is still expanding, that heaven somehow is some geographical place outside the universe. Well, we will come on to later, but probably our Enlightenment understandings of space and time need to change, and that's what the Ascension challenges.
Yes, yeah, Rose.
I think it's something I would agree with that actually, is the sense of, I think for a lot of things within the church, we've forgotten three very important words. It's a mystery. We seem to want to explain everything all of the time, and I always come back to my time in my previous parish, where a little girl asked me what happened between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and I was just honest with her and said, it's a mystery. I think this thing happened. I think, I believe that Jesus went down to hell and rescued people and things like that. We call it the harrowing of hell, but I can't prove that. There's many things I can't prove, but I have faith that happened. But ultimately, it's a mystery, and I think we've lost that joy of the mystery in trying to explain everything. I can't tell you necessarily how the host becomes both bread and body at the same time, but I believe it. I believe it with all my heart, and that. But so I think I agree with Vincent. Is that the Enlightenment and reason has many good things it brought, but it also has it's destroyed something as well.
Yeah, I think we should cling on to the Magnum Mysterium, shouldn't we? The great mystery that is our faith, and I think there's a lot to be found in that mystery. I think Rowan Williams wrote that, I'm going to quote him here, in the Ascension, Jesus hasn't just gone away, he's gone deeper into the hearts of reality, our reality and God's. As ever, a simple way of putting it with Rowan, with profound undercurrent running through that. He's gone into the reality, God's new reality. That's quite a remarkable thought, isn't it? That God now lives with a new realization of what he is and what we are. And I suppose when Jesus came down to earth fully as a man and fully as God, the incarnation therefore can never be undone. You know, it happened, it was there. So having become a man, God remains a man forever now. You know, so he's not going to retract that at any point, is he? So it's important that that humanity continues to go on in heaven for us. So what do you think Jesus is doing in heaven right now? You know, what is he actually up to? Is he just sitting there on the side of the Father, as it were, as we see in sort of, you know, paintings by Cranach and the early sort of northern Renaissance artists, you know, sort of twiddling his thumbs while his Father sits rather Pope-like in his tiara? What does Jesus do for us now then?
For me, the big subject here is what we think worship is. I personally, my position is, I don't think anything we do is worship. What we do offer a lot of human interaction, and Christ's role at this point, don't forget, as we said, having taken that material body into the Godhead, is to turn what we offer into worship to the Father. So he is the link, he is the one who in some senses, decodes our language for the Father. So that's the main role which Christ plays at this point, is to continue that journey of bringing all parties together.
So to take our imperfect worship, as limited as it is in our human ways and our human minds and our human speech, and turn it into something perfect for us. So is he an intercessor, therefore? Rose, would you say that Jesus is an intercessor?
I would say, is it, and usually for me, not a long-winded answer. Yes, that's exactly what he is. You know, it is just that he intercedes. And I was just thinking, suddenly, just it came to my mind when Vincent was talking about worship, was William Temple's quote about to worship is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God, to feed the mind with the truth of God, to purge the imagination by the beauty of God, and to open the heart to the love of God, to devote the will to the purpose of God. And that's exactly what Christ is doing. Christ is interceding for us and opening us up to the will of God. Yeah,
because human flesh is now with God, interceding for us. Do you think, I always get the idea that what you have in dialogue with the Ascension is this idea of glorification as well, that Jesus returns as fully human into the Godhead and is the glorified version of his earthly self, obviously. You know, I do get a sense of, and in the letter to Hebrews, which is probably not Pauline, of course, it's quite a different theology going on there, but one that really speaks to me. In Hebrews, you know, he is our high priest, isn't he? You know, he's taken on the role of Melchizedek. He is, as you say, Vincent, got the right language, the right rites and rituals, but there's a kind of glorification around him as well. Do you think that idea of Christ in glory is inherent in the Ascension stories as well?
Yes, I mean, the letters of Hebrews is crucial here for an understanding of the ascended Christ. For me, we need to tackle this issue of space and time. Very often when we talk about our Christian faith, it's really in relation to just the one aspect, to time. We talk about, some would say they know a date when their faith began, a conversion point. They would talk about their pilgrimage through life. We talk about the coming of Christ in the future. All these really are somewhere along our concept of time, linear time.
It's a linear narrative, yeah.
Yes, but we don't really talk about the spatial aspect of faith. You know, we can experience different times in one space. We can visit the same space, go to the same church at different times, and in that one space we can experience all different moments and times. But the reverse is very tricky and not possible. We would according to our Enlightenment reason, would be led to believe. But that's what the Ascension offers, a challenge to that. Christ, the ascended Christ, the glorified Christ, makes possible other possibilities. That to me is what's intriguing. You know, the church has to grapple. What we're still offering in our worship, in our liturgy, is either medieval worship, if we belong to one wing, or we offer sort of Enlightenment modern worship if we belong to the other wing. We still, as if Einstein and quantum theory has never actually come into being. By the way, one we often hear of relativity, but quantum theory, symmetry. I'll try and simplify this, but what's intriguing of it for Ascension, the idea of symmetry, you know, at CERN, they've been able to see what things appear and disappear out of nowhere. But this idea that, say you wanted to bake a cake, but you had no ingredients, but you would have a cake in the future. So you borrow those ingredients from the future. And as long as once you've baked your cake, you pay those ingredients back as quick as you can, no one notices. And that's happening around us all the time at an atomic level. Well, doesn't that offer intriguing explanations for what might have been going on at the Ascension? Not the rocket, which is going to the end of the known universe, but emerging into a different understanding of space.
C.S. Lewis, you know, dealt with this
Yes.
in one of his many essays, and he uses the analogy of a stage curtain, or, you know, in a proscenium arch stage, that the actor walks through, you know, from one space into another, and yet you can't kind of see the gap, really. You know, the actor seems to emerge and then can disappear again into it. And on that, I was thinking about, okay, how to deal with this idea of these spatial dimensions. You know, I don't think it's any longer relevant for us to look to heaven and think that it's a physical space, as you said. You know, otherwise it would be expanding, and, you know, we don't look there anymore. But I like this idea of the dimensions working simultaneously, and of course that's what happens in his Narnia books, isn't it? And even though he said himself that he never intended the Narnia stories to be taken as an allegory, nevertheless, of course, they are. I mean, that's how they've been read, and in his own letters, he responded to them as allegories as well. So I always think that idea of, you know, of walking through the wardrobe into a new space is the same kind of thing that's happening with Christ and the Ascension as well. So he, you know, it takes on a different space, a different time, a different form. And I also think that the way in which C.S. Lewis uses the children with their very physical bodies, you know, their earthiness, their rather traumatic experiences in the Second World War, and they go through this portal, they find the glorified version of themselves. They all become sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, and they all become kings and queens of Narnia, the very best that they can be, you know, intercessors themselves and communicators with others too. So I think even if he didn't really write it that way, I think actually the Narnia stories give us an idea of that idea of flexibility of space too. Does that speak to you, Rose, at all in any way?
Because the thing is, the Ascension is Jesus hasn't come back yet. That's what our hope is. But in Narnia, the children return back to their earthly sense. You know, they return. So they're there at the end of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. They're there riding on their lovely horses, and they see the lamppost, this sign. And, you know, we've got to remember that the lamppost, the iron of the lamppost, is a motif, a ribbon, a theme that runs all the way through the Chronicles of Narnia. You know, from the magician's nephew with the rings through to that earthly ironness is there all the way through. But you know, they're riding through, and they see the lamppost, and they realize, and they start to remember, and they're drawn back to the earthly plane. But Jesus isn't drawn back to the earthly plane in that way. They're not going back in spirit. They're going back in a bodily way, and they and when they return, they're back in their in the earthly childlike form. And again, the only person who takes them seriously is the nutty professor. And so I wonder what your view of that would be, that actually they return back to their earthly form, and how that then serves the allegory of Narnia as the Ascension.
I guess for me, it's this idea of obviously the imperfect human, aren't we? We're all imperfect, and they go through whole stages as in Narnia in which they kind of deal with their imperfections, but they still are human and not transfigured. It's not the same thing. So they have to keep coming back. Of course they do. But also C.S. Lewis propels them back into Narnia again, where they resume their glorious positions too. So he plays on that idea all the time. Of course, the one character that doesn't step through any portal is Aslan, of course, who of course is the Christ figure for the whole thing. He is firmly and utterly in physical form within Narnia itself as well.
Yeah, but I think for me that's what's wonderful about Narnia is actually, yes, the children are the heightened version of themselves, a glorified version of themselves, but it's still a material world. It's not dreamlike. This is not, there's the real world on the one side of the wardrobe and a dream on the other side. This is a real world you can exist in, and it's particular. So when Christ has ascended, he hasn't ascended into some spiritual cloud. The dimension he is in is a real reality, another real world, yes. A better real world, possibly.
A better real world, absolutely. We know, and I think it's fascinating, isn't it? In those incidents just before the ascension, when he appears to his disciples, he sits with them and eats and so forth. Just to show that this body is real. And then also offering Thomas to touch his side and his hands and so forth. And that moment where we have Rose, you mentioned it earlier on. The famous "Noli me tangere." In Greek, it's "memu aptu." So don't touch me, it's translated as. But actually, what Jesus is saying to Mary Magdalene is actually don't cling to me. And I think what he's saying there is actually more of it's a metaphor. Don't you, the disciples, my infant church, depend on me right now, because I'm going to have to go away. Because if we read it as a physical touching, don't touch me because I'm fragile, or you might put your hand through me or something. It makes no sense of the later scene that happens in the upper room with Thomas then, where Jesus invites him readily, to touch, poke your finger in there, have a go at that, So
that exchange between Mary Magdalene and Jesus in the garden, I always think, it always strikes me as, and I think many people will disagree with me with this, but that idea of "don't touch me" is far more simple than yes, it's connected with the ascension and things like that, but there is a far more simple explanation. Is the fact that she thinks he's the gardener. His resurrection's a messy, painful business, just like birth. And so part of me always wondered whether when he says "don't touch me" is because he was actually, he just resurrected. If you're aching and things, you don't want somebody to touch you. So I wonder sometimes. It's a thought that comes to me now and again of, is it a very, very human response?
But interestingly, each of our readings there, disparate they might be, are actually all connected to the idea this is a physical body, though, isn't it? Capable of feeling pain or whatever it is. And I think that's the moment. I think we need to hold on to that moment in John so that we can make sense of the ascension in Luke. Really, that's what we have to kind of jigsaw these together sometimes. I'm going to ask. Okay, this is a question then. Okay, this is going to be all right. This is the zinger. If Jesus' ascended body has gone to heaven and now sits with the Father and is the Father, what is the gender of that body now? Because in the church right now, okay, we're going through, rightly so, an enormous cross-examination of ourselves on our relationship to gender and identity. Does, therefore, the ascended living body of a glorified Christ, only in male form, work for us any longer. You know, I'm coming to this because I've been reading things like very recently the recent Lent readings book for the Archbishop Canterbury's Lent book was on the Lord's Prayer, and you know, the whole starting with Our Father, and how that can also often be read very negatively now as well, as, you know, too patriarchal, too demanding, whatever it might be, and even the Aramaic Abba has a softer, definitely a softer ring to it, but still, you know, you can't get away from it. It is still a male there. So what do we make then of a God, of Christ who goes on forever interceding with us, but purely in his 1st century BCE Jewish form, essentially, right? I mean, if he's a Jew that walked the earth in the 1st century BCE, as we are all agreed he was, is that what he is? How then can he understand us all if he is still in that form? Who wants to have a crack at that one?
I'm quite happy, but I think Rose is dying to jump
Rose,
in.
go on, you go first. Go on, Rose.
Oh, you lovely thing, you. I think I said that when I was researching this, I was really astounded by the complete woeful lack of academic engagement. So I looked at queer engagement. So I even put things out on social media. You know, things like Hive Mind, hit me with your queer, liberationist, feminist, womanist views of the Ascension. Very little came back. And what did come back, so somebody sent me a picture of a gay Jesus ascending, but Jesus is still a man. And to be honest, I grappled with that picture. You can look it up. If you just type in gay Jesus ascending in Google, you'll pick up a picture that's a very, very powerful picture, a very erotic picture of Jesus embraced by God ascending. And I struggled with that on many levels, partly because it seemed a bit incestuous. But you know, and I don't deny that there's throughout the history of the church, we've spoken about God in an erotic way. You've only got to look at the poetry of John Donne and Batter My Heart, 3-person God, and all that jazz, to see that sometimes we do talk about our engagement with God in an erotic fashion. However, I'm not sure whether I agree with that image. Then the next thing I typed in brought up another image, was an image of a trans Jesus going up, wonderfully subversive, but still in a male form. I couldn't find, then I found a book about Krista, but again, it was only a little tiny bit about the Ascension. Very, very little has been written about the debate and for gender. Indeed, I was talking to a possible PhD supervisor, and I nearly ended up saying to him, do you know what, I'm going to completely change my idea for what I want to do my PhD in, because I want to write about gender and the Ascension. I'm still going to write about trauma and theodicy, but I dallied for a little bit. But I wonder whether that's because this is such a difficult doctrine to reconcile anyway. Because if we do believe in a full bodily ascension, and I, as much as I loved my debates with Vincent as we've been preparing for this, I struggle with the ascension, because there's a part of me that wants to believe in only a spiritual ascension, because then that allows me to grapple with my own belief of, I suppose for, would it be apophatic? Yeah, it would be apophatic. That apophatic belief, God cannot, that negative theology of God cannot exist because God is existence. We see it throughout, modern theology. And that allows then for a genderless God, because of course, I can't remember who said it, I think it was Mary Beard or somebody said, if God is male, then male is God. It allows for the patriarchy. That, we cannot get away from the fact that the fact that God is spoken about in male terms, that Jesus is spoken about in male terms, has allowed for such crimes such as, the abuses that come from the misuse of complementarianism and things like that. The way that even down to the way that we approach LGBT people. So quite often in the church, I'm an LGBT woman, But quite often when we represent LGBT people in the church, it's LGBT men that we see. Gay men are represented in the church, not lesbian women, bisexual women, trans men, trans women. It's gay men whenever we talk about LGBT. Indeed, quite often gay is used as an umbrella term for everything LGBT, when it's wrong, because it erases people's labels and erases people's individual identities. So I struggle with it, because I want to so desperately say it's a spiritual ascension, because that allows me philosophically to be able to process and be able
to see the morphing of gender and identity and race, for that matter, too, right? So
again, our race, the ideas of race, it comes down to straight away is our view of Jesus, because actually the race side of things is well, Jesus is a Palestinian man. He wasn't white. So our views of race come from, again, that patriarchal view of a nice, straight, white Jesus. We might get into Jesus' sexuality on another conversation if we're feeling brave.
We'll do that.
But it's, so I struggle, because actually I do believe in a full body resurrection. And my catechism tells me, and everything tells me, that it's a full body ascension. So I am so conflicted about it. So I'll hand over to Vincent now, because I've run out of things and I may heresies and get myself struck off. So go on, Fido.
Vincent, what's your take on this then? The body of Jesus and its gender.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Rose has outlined as the problem. I don't think the ascension adds anything new, in a sense, to that debate. What it does, it brings it to a climax, to a point where you have to decide, cards on the table. Jesus is a first century Jew, he's a man, it's very particular. It's always this grappling when we talk about any of the world religions, this contrast between the particular and universal. And that's what's wonderful about Christianity, that it is here to point out that the material world, who we are, particular people, is important. It's not Buddhism. It's not about rising above to some universal spirit to get away from all this world. It is accepting. Jesus accepted the limitations. If God was going to be incarnate in a human being, he could have come in a gender neutral, all sorts of different versions of himself, but he chose to come in a particular way. He always addressed using a particular form of words. Now, the one way we can try and challenge certain accepted views is what, do not call anyone on earth father. He's saying, I'm going to use the word father, but I'm using it not in the way that you use it. Every use of the word father on earth is used in different power games, etc. But I'm going to use the word father not in that way. So you could say that the ascension, yes, is particular, but Christ is going to use that particularity in a very different way than what we're used to. That's the only get out I can find for you, Rose, really.
Yeah. For me, it's that we approach Christ through his ascended body as a human being that's united with God. And I think if we just allow it to be the neutral human, then I think in all our humility, when we approach Christ in prayer, then Christ will adapt himself to us, because he's giving in that way, It's simply love that we get back from Christ. So whatever our sexuality, whatever our identity, whatever our ethnicity, Christ will respond to us on that level without us having to make issue of it. So I would say, think of him as a human being in whatever form you want, and Christ will respond, I think.
I think as well is worth remembering is, especially if you're of a Catholic theology, Catholic sacramental theology, is, of course, we have the Marian theology going on as well, which, okay, for most of it is apocryphal, but at the end of the day, on August the 15th, we have the Assumption. Now, you could say that the church likes its binaries, and again, it's not perfect because of the fact that we know now that there's a huge spectrum of genders. It's not just male and female. But just as there is a masculinizing, a humanizing of God in the Ascension, what we also have is, of course, is the Queen of Heaven. Mary is taken up. She's assumpted. Now, we have to do some headwork as theologians in terms of what is the difference between an ascension and an assumption, because that can be confusing, because, of course, we're told that Jesus is taken up to the right hand of God, but is he on the right hand of God, or is he within God? What's going on there? Because then we're told about the Assumption, and Mary is in heaven, and there's a feminizing of heaven going on, with Mary as Queen of Heaven interceding for us as well. Because, of course, as an Anglican, it is perfectly acceptable to believe in the saints and to venerate the saints, because we don't pray to the saints like as if they're gods. We pray with the saints, because they are within the mystical body of Christ. They are up there, and we can ask them to pray, just like I would ask you to pray for me, Lloyd, or I'd ask Vincent to pray for me. So I wonder, and this is just me throwing it out there, is how does Mary come into play in terms of gender, in terms of the Godhead and heaven and things like that? Now I may be going off on a complete tangent here, but it just suddenly struck me as something interesting.
Well, for me, I have to be honest, Rose, she doesn't at all. She simply doesn't. I'm pretty Lutheran in my response to Mary. I recognize her humility and her complete abandonment of herself to accept God's will. But I also then read from what I see in the Gospels, and that is actually a distancing of Christ from Mary throughout. So she doesn't do what she does for me, what she does for you. But that's absolutely fine, I think, because we've got to work our own way through this, haven't we? We've got to get our own paths through this. And I think that's absolutely fine.
Marian perspective, just as a way of, how it was something that, as I was trying to reconcile myself, I kept coming back to the Assumption, and it's something I'm going to have to research further. But I think
it's perfectly feasible. I really do, and I can absolutely understand it comes from absolutely the right place, because of this absence of. Well, nobody's doing the work on this. You're absolutely right. Nobody is really thinking this through for us, and it does deserve a lot of thought. I think. I'm aware of the time is coming to an end, so we should end now and say thank you to all of you for listening, and we really hope now that you will join us on Assumption Thursday, which is May the 13th. Am I right? Yes, at 7:30. You'll find all of the details for how to join this conversation on the details below. You only have to click on that, and there'll be a live Zoom link so you can come and join us. And please, what we really encourage and what we were delighted with last time when we spoke on Lamentations was the different interactions that went on. Maybe you've thought about Ascension all your life, maybe you've never given it a second thought, but we would really, really like to hear what you have to say and see if we can't keep this conversation going. That's the aim. So for me, it's diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr.
Fawr.
See you next time.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.